The dust had barely settled when the little girl stepped forward, her voice trembling, yet clear as a church bell. "Can you take her instead of me?" she asked, pointing at the frail woman clutching her shawl in the wind. The cowboy froze. The town went silent. In that moment, the choice before him was heavier than his revolver, older than the desert itself. No one breathed. Then, without a word, he reached out his hand and took them both. No one knew it yet, but that single act would change the fate of an entire valley. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The outpost squatted at the edge of everything, the last splinter of civilization before the plain unrolled into nothing. Its sun-bleached boards and rusted signs whispering of debts unpaid and promises broken. Heat shimmered off the street like a ghost, and dust lay on the air in layers, as if the town itself had been breathing slow for a long time and had stopped in the middle of an old regret. Cole McGraw stood in the center of that thin world, a silhouette in a battered duster, hat pulled down so his eyes were a shadow, in his mouth a curve that had learned to hold its peace. Men glanced at him the way men glance at storms, with a kind of respect that masks the knowledge of what might come. They had ridden in with the certainty of men who collect what others owe, three hard men with tighter jaws than conscience, boots that had flattened more lives than grass, led by a bounty posted in a town 2 counties wide. The exchange was simple on paper: a name, 2 horses, a purse heavy with the kind of coins that smear a man's hands. But paper never knows how a soft voice will fold even the fiercest intention. The woman clutched her shawl like a lifeline, the schwa threadbare and smelling faintly of lavender and fever, and beside her the little girl stood with tiny feet dug into the dirt, hair sun-faded and eyes too old for such a small mouth. The little girl looked at Cole as if he were an answer she had been taught to hope for, and then she stepped forward, small against the world, but not silent, and when she spoke the boardwalk seemed to hold its breath. "Can you take her instead of me?" she asked, voice trembling but perfect. A bell struck in a chapel that had never expected visitors. The words landed like a stone in a quiet pool, and the ripples reached into places Cole had thought long dried up: memory, regret, the reckoning of a life lived on the edge of right and wrong. The posse laughed first, a rough, cruel sound meant to peel courage off a man. But the laughter cleaved open as Cole's face shifted, not with shock, not with calculation, but with the slow unspooling of something that had been coiled in him for years, a choice that weighed heavier than gunmetal, older than the desert, older than the law the men thought they represented. There was a hush, the town listening like a congregation to a sermon that never used to be spoken aloud, and in that hush Cole felt the past press at his ribs, the silhouette of a child he had failed, the brand on his hand that had been a promise and a chain, the nights by lantern where he had counted what he had lost. He could have handed the woman over. He could have pocketed the purse and ridden with the easy lie that he was only a man making a living. The posse would have understood. Instead, without a sermon and without a flourish, he lowered his weathered hand and reached for them both. No words crossed the street. His movement was a quiet verdict. He wrapped the shawl about the woman, lifted the little girl into a stead he had not planned to spare, 2 passengers whose weight rearranged the compass of his life, and in that single breath the town shifted. Men shifted in their boots. The leader of the posse swore a soft oath and spat into the dust. Cole mounted, the horse snorting, the whole hollow of the valley seeming to breathe out as if relieved of something heavy. He did not speak. He rode away with them. No trumpets, no promises, only the soft clack of hoofs and the whisper of skirts, leaving behind questions that would ferment into stories and a silence that would slowly grow into a legend. Cole's gaze moved like a slow metronome between the small, sun-scorched face of the girl and the pale, fevered hollow of her mother's cheeks, and in that movement the whole tenor of the moment changed. The men behind him, tight-jawed, cigarette ash to the lip, boots that had flattened more than just dirt, shifted their weight as if daring Cole to show the measure of his courage, and one of them let a scoff loose. "She's just a woman," spoken as if simplicity itself could settle what the heart could not. But Cole's silence hung like a loaded measure between 2 notes, not empty but dense with thought, and anyone paying attention would have read in the slight tightening of his jaw the ledger of a life that kept running along debt. Under his hat the shadow played across a face that had learned to speak little and to decide more. The brand on his hand itched like an old promise, memory coiling up from the marrow. Faces that should have been his to guard, names he had failed to keep, a cradle left empty under a winter star, and guilt, that patient animal, rubbed at his ribs. The town's dust tasted of coin and old grudges. Pox circled indifferent above, and the men's laughter tried to fill the silence but only tore at it, revealing the rawness beneath. The little girl, small as a prayer and steadier than any of the grown men, did not flinch. She met his eyes with a look that folded everything into one simple ask: "Can you take her instead of me?" And in that small, terrible clarity Cole saw not a plea but an indictment. He could have been the sort of man who turned when Wyndham money called, collected the purse, handed over the woman, rode with a story easy enough to tell at any saloon table. The posse would have nodded. The world would have continued its grinding. But something in him, call it a conscience, call it the last coal of a long-dead fire, moved with the slow, inexorable weight of a man who finally chose the harder thing. His hand went to the horse as if to mount and depart, then paused. He adjusted the duster across his shoulder, as if to hide the tremor that might show how deep the choice reached. The leader spat into the dirt. The sound meant to be sharp, decisive, but it landed like an accusation. The others barked and called names meant to shame, meant to bend him back into the simple calculus of reward. Cole did not answer. He let the air carry their words away. Instead he stepped forward, not with words, not with a sermon, but with the simple economy of action. He gathered the woman's shawl, careful as if he were handling a promise, and he lifted the little girl with arms that had scar tissue and apology stitched into them. The movement read as surrender to some and as salvation to others. Horses shifted, spurs clinked, and the town seemed to lean in, trying to see where his compass pointed. There was no dramatic speech, no flourish of heroic light, just the raw honesty of someone making up for a ledger long overdue. He swung into the saddle, the two small bodies finding place against him as if they had always belonged there. And for an instant the world was a tableau of fragile trust, of breaths held and futures renegotiated. The posse muttered, threats skittering like gravel under horses' hooves. The leader cursed low and made a motion like a man deciding whether to follow law or to keep his coin. Cole's horse snorted and took the first step that would carry them out of the town's small horizon and into the open country that had no use for the petty certainties of men who collected debts. Dust rose in a ribbon behind them, a thin veil separating what had been from what might be, and as the sun tilted, slicing the land into a hard, burning line, Cole did not look back. There was nothing there for him but the echo of boots and the taste of dried blood in the mouth of memory, and ahead lay a road that would ask more of him than any purse ever could. They rode under a sky that looked bruised, as if the heavens themselves had learned to hurt and was keeping it to itself, and the land around them unfolded like an old, patient wound, stubble and stone in the slow, indifferent sweep of sage, while Cole McGraw sat forward in the saddle as though leaning into some private weather, his silhouette a stubborn punctuation against a horizon that offered no answers. The horse's hoofs tapped a steady, small book rhythm, and with every measured clack the burden of two small lives shifted closer to the place in him that had been hollowed out by years of choices and silence. The woman, wrapped in that thinning shawl that smelled faintly of lavender and peppermint and sickness, held the child with an almost ritual tenderness, the girl's head tucked against her shoulder like a bird finding shelter in the last branch of a dying tree, and the child's fingers kept tracing the edge of the shawl as if memorizing the fabric so that memory might outlast fever. Cole said nothing. Words had been bankrupt in his mouth long enough that silence had grown into its own language, sharp, true, and full of the weight of things unsaid. The girl watched him sometimes from beneath lashes dark as new coal, and in her gaze there was a reckoning that did not belong to someone so small. Questions, yes, but deeper, hopefully leaning toward command, and it steadied him more than any command from a lawman ever had. Wind moved across the plain like a slow hand, lifting grit and carrying the faint clink of the town's far bell away until it was only rumor. It answered none of the things they needed answered, only made the distance between their breaths and the next town feel longer, as if the land wanted them to measure themselves by endurance alone. Between the dunes and dusk the past came back in fragments, the creak of a cradle, the echo of a lullaby that once meant something other than loss, the hollow ring of a laughter that had been cut short. In these echoes Cole felt a face he had not turned to remember, a child's small fingers slipping from his own, a line in a room that he had not been able to keep. The memory was raw and quick, and it left him with a taste like iron. Guilt rose in him like a tide he had kept at bay for years, and with it the slow, stubborn ember of wanting to make something right even if the world would not count it. The girl asked no questions that night beyond the ones her eyes already owned, no why voiced, only a steady trust that placed all decisions into the custody of a man whose voice was a rumor. She passed a hand over his sleeve once, as if testing the fabric of his promise, and he felt the touch as Val made without parade. They camped under a sky spotted with early stars, and Cole tended the horse while keeping one half of himself awake. He watched the woman breathe shallow into the shawl and listened to the slow, fragile music of the child's breathing, and in the light of the small fire that might as well have been a lighthouse, he thought of the ledger of his life, the names he had kept and the ones he had let go. The ache in his chest was not guilt alone, but the recognition that choices are not paid for in coin. They are paid for in distance traveled and things carried. He remembered a boy he had once failed to reach, a face turned the wrong way at a doorway, a promise left cold on a sill. Those were the debts no wanted poster could list, and they came due not with the pound of a gavel, but with the soft, accusing weight of a child's hand in yours. Dawn would find them further down the trail, the world rearranged by the miles they put between it and the town. But in the small hours the desert taught them what the town could not, how thin and stubborn inhuman hope could be when pressed into the palm of two simple lives. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the rough bark of the trees surrounding their makeshift camp, a small, fragile haven in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The girl, whose name Cole still didn't know, leaned closer to the warmth, her eyes, wide and thoughtful, fixed on the man opposite her. As Cole reached out to adjust a log, his hand briefly entered the brighter circle of light. It was then she saw it, a scar etched deep into the skin just above his wrist. It wasn't an accidental wound, it was a deliberate, brindled design, a jagged, stylized symbol that looked hauntingly like a brand. Curiosity overcoming caution, she pointed a small finger toward the mark. "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper against the gentle roar of the fire. Cole froze, his hands suspended in the air. The easy, though reserved, companionship they had built over the last 3 days of travel instantly fractured. He pulled his hand back quickly, tucking it under the sleeve of his worn, dark coat, and his gaze dropped to the flickering flames. A long, agonizing silence settled between them, broken only by the sick, shallow breathing of the woman lying bundled on a bed of pine boughs beside him. The girl didn't press, but her eyes held a silent question that demanded an answer. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to draw all the air from his lungs, Cole lifted his head. His eyes, usually sharp and watchful, were distant, clouded with ancient pain. "That mark," he began, his voice raspy, a sound of disuse. He paused, swallowed hard, and stared unblinking into the heart of the fire, as if seeing his own history reflected in the incandescent coals. The firelight caught the grim set of his jaw and the tension in his shoulders. "That mark cost me everything." The words, spoken so softly, fell into the night air with the chilling weight of a confession, a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. They hung there, tangible and terrible, instantly swallowed by the immense, indifferent darkness that pressed in on their tiny island of light. From the shadows, the feverish woman stirred, her eyelids fluttering open briefly. Her lips moved, dry and cracked, and a barely audible sound escaped, a weak, whispered prayer, an appeal to a silent, distant God for mercy or perhaps for strength. Cole didn't look at her, but he heard. He always heard. He was aware of the woman's fading life force, the girl's innocent fear, and the perpetual, cold fact of his own flight. He stared into the flames, seeing not the warmth but the consuming blaze of his past, the brutal irony that the very thing he'd tried to escape had been burned onto his skin for all the world to see. He knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in his gut, that he was once again running from the law that had branded him, running from the vicious man who had pursued him since he broke free, and, most damningly, running from the very man the brand had forged him into. The wilderness was vast, but his sanctuary was small, and the shadow of that mark felt longer than the firelight. The morning air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but a different, cold smell, the scent of imminent danger, had begun to overlay the natural aromas as the first rays of dawn sliced through the forest canopy. Cole hadn't slept, instead spending the long hours of the night listening, his senses tuned to the slightest shift in the wilderness, As the light strengthened, painting the dew-kissed leaves in gold and green, he crouched atop a low, rocky ridge, his gaze sweeping the sparse plains they had crossed the previous day. That's when he saw them, faint specks in the distance, yet unmistakable, 3 men on horseback, moving with a practiced, relentless pace that spoke of purpose and grim determination. They were still far off, shimmering slightly in the nascent heat of the rising sun, but their pursuit was undeniable. They weren't travelers or trappers, they were bounty men, their silhouette instantly recognizable by the hard set of their shoulders and the way they held their rifles, ready for a quick, brutal end to their hunt. A deep, sick dread twisted in Cole's gut. He dropped back down to the camp, his movements sudden and urgent, kicking the remaining embers of the fire into dust. The girl, already awake and tending to her mother, instantly sensed the seismic shift in his demeanor. The quiet, watchful tension of the night had ratcheted up to a desperate, electrifying fear. She immediately moved closer to the pallet where her mother, pale and still ravaged by the fever, lay semi-conscious, clutching the rough blanket to her chest. Cole began to hastily repack the few supplies they had, his hands moving with a frantic, expert speed. "Get ready, we're moving now," he commanded, his voice low and gravelly, the sound of a predator spotting its own hunter. He didn't have to explain the danger, the palpable threat in his hurried actions was clear enough. The girl's eyes widened, reflecting the fear in his own, and she didn't question him, simply nodding and wrapping a protective arm around her ailing pair. As he cinched the saddlebag onto the mare's back, Cole spoke, the words barely audible, a harsh whisper meant more for the wind than for the girl. "They'll take her if they catch us," he muttered, his eyes darting back toward the ridge, measuring the distance and the time he had lost. The revelation was stark and horrifying. These riders weren't after a simple reward for catching a fugitive, or even the small bounty that might be on his own branded head. They were after the woman, after the knowledge she carried. The woman was the prize, the key to something vital and dangerous that had set these dogs on their trail. With a violent thrust, he pulled the woman gently but firmly onto the mare, cradling her against the saddle. He then lifted the girl and placed her in front of her mother, where she could hold onto the sick woman and keep her steady. The chase began then, not with the starting gun, but with the silent, desperate realization that their time had run out. Cole leapt onto his own horse, digging his heels into its flanks, forcing it into a jarring gallop that tore them away from the scant safety of their camp. The flight was not just a physical act of escape through the land, it was a desperate, moral race through his conscience. Every stride the horses took hammered home the truth: he was responsible for these 2 fragile lives now. His past, represented by the mark on his hand and the life he was running from, had collided violently with his present, forcing him to protect this woman and her daughter from the dark forces that had found them. Cole knew the riders weren't just chasing the woman for herself, they're chasing what she knows, a secret so profound and perilous that men were willing to ride hundreds of miles and kill to retrieve it. And by saving her, Cole had unwittingly made that secret, and the relentless hunters, his own. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. The desperate, jarring gallop continued for hours until Cole finally steered the horses into a dense, almost impenetrable thicket of willow and cottonwood near a shallow, winding creek, hoping the rough terrain would temporarily mask their trail. Exhausted and sweating, the trio dismounted. The woman, despite the bone-jarring ride, seemed momentarily clearer, the oppressive fog of her fever having slightly lifted, perhaps chased away by the sheer adrenaline of the chase. She was still weak, leaning heavily against the tree, but her eyes, when they met Cole's, were lucid and filled with a desperate, heavy truth she could no longer keep silent. Cole, his face grim and dusted with the trail, was cleaning his rifle, his movements economical and lethal. He knew he was carrying more than just 2 people. He was carrying a dangerous burden, and he intended to understand its weight. The woman's voice was ready, yet firm as she finally spoke, pulling the real story from the silence they had kept. "I have to tell you," she began, taking a ragged breath that seemed to cost her a great deal of strength. "I'm not an outlaw's wife. I'm a witness." Cole paused, the cloth in his hand stilling on the rifle barrel, his expression hardening immediately, moving from tense vigilance to grim understanding. She went on, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken, detailing a crime far more complex and perilous than a simple robbery or death. I saw it. We both saw it, she corrected, glancing down at the little girl who was clinging to her skirt, eyes wide and focused on Cole. They had witnessed the marshal's brother murder a preacher, a man named Thomas, in cold blood, not over a brawl or a personal vendetta, but for a vast, desirable tract of land the preacher had been legally holding. The murder had been swift, brutal, and covered up by the corrupt machinery of the local law, protected by the very badge of the powerful marshal. As the woman spoke, detailing the sheer callousness of the crime and the immense power of the men detecting the killer, Cole's expression darkened into a mask of cold fury and resignation. The mark on his hand throbbed, a phantom pain reminding him of the systems of injustice he knew all too well. He understood immediately the kind of men who rose to power and the ruthless lengths they would go to protect the powerful members of their clan. A simple outlaw could be hanged by any judge. A witness against a marshal's brother meant running from an entire, inescapable structure of authority. He slowly stood up, placing the now clean rifle across his chest. His voice was low, cutting through the quiet woods like a honed blade. "You should have run farther," he stated, a grim, undeniable truth in his tone, a lament for the naive belief that they could outrun such evil. The woman met his gaze, no longer pleading, but stating a fact that sealed their shared fate. "We did," she replied, her own eyes filled with a sad, terrible irony, "until you found us." The admission hung between them, the moment their separate journeys converged at the riverbank, an inescapable knot. By taking them in, by protecting them, Cole had not saved two strangers. He had stepped directly into the crosshairs of the powerful men whose corruption had branded his own existence. He was no longer running from his own past, but carrying the weight of theirs. And now, in the unforgiving heart of the wilderness, their fates were tied with the unbreakable bond of a shared enemy and the truth that demanded blood. The quiet tension that had clung to the air since dawn finally shattered violently at dusk. Cole had chosen a defensible, narrow pass winding between two high, rocky outcroppings, a place where the incoming riders would be forced into single file. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaking hues of orange and violent red, providing a deceptive calm before the storm. The sound of hoofs striking stone echoed through the valley, and Cole moved instantly, pushing the woman and the girl deeper into a crevice, shoving his own rifle into the space between the rocks, its barrel trained on the approaching shadows. The first gunfire erupted loud, sharp cracks that ripped the silence to shreds. Cole didn't hesitate, his own weapon roaring back, the recoil barely registering in his shoulder. He fired not just with skill, but with a terrifying, desperate ferocity, a man fighting not merely for survival but for a chance at oblivion. One of the pursuers falls instantly, dropping from his saddle with a sickening, heavy thud that was muffled by the dust. Cole shifted his aim in a fluid, practiced motion, tracking the second rider who was trying to pull his horse into cover. A moment later, a cry of pain was carried on the wind. The second man was wounded, his shot going wild as he clutched his side, clearly pulling back. Cole fought like a man trying to erase something inside himself. A lifetime of guilt and pain poured into every precise, lethal movement. He wasn't just defending them. He was battling the ghost of the man who bore the brand, seeking to justify the price that Mark had demanded. His movements were far too efficient, too cold, for a simple vagrant or a green protector. They belonged to a trained killer, a soldier, or perhaps a highly skilled man of the law who had gone terribly astray. The brief, brutal skirmish ended as quickly as it began, leaving a thick, acrid haze of gunpowder hanging over the pass and the low, terrified whinnying of horses echoing in the twilight. Cole lowered the rifle, his breathing shallow and quick, his chest heaving, his eyes still fixed on the trail. When he finally turned, stepping out of the shadows, the woman trembled, but not from fear of the carnage, or even the close proximity of death. Her trembling was born of awe, a sudden, horrifying realization of the caliber of the men who had taken them on. She looked at the stark difference between the hunted and the hunter, the way he had moved, the clinical violence of his defense. "You're no bounty hunter," she whispers, the accusation laced with a fearful respect, confirming the deeper danger he represented. He had been a predator of some kind before this. Cole says nothing, his silence more damning than any confession. He reached up, his hand still shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and wipes blood from his cheek, not his own, but the spatter from the first man who fell. His gaze bypassed her, bypassing the immediacy of their relief, and instead went toward the burning ridge on the horizon, where the sunset still glowed. He knew with an absolute certainty that the attack was not over. This was merely the scouting party. In the chilling light of tomorrow, he knew 2 more riders will come, harder, smarter, and angrier, and he had just shown them exactly what kind of enemy they were dealing with. The flight continued through the deepest part of the night, driven by the knowledge that the survivors of the skirmish would soon return, reinforced and seeking vengeance. Just before dawn, the forest abruptly surrendered to a wide, open expanse where the turbulent waters of the Redwater River roared past, a turning line of cold, relentless energy cutting through the land. The sight was both a reprieve and a formidable obstacle. Cole knew the riders would be slowed by the water, but the river itself posed a deadly threat to the fever-weakened woman. He dismounted quickly, his muscles aching with exhaustion but his mind alert. The water was fast and deep enough to sweep away anyone without strength. Without a word, he carefully helped the woman off the mare, her weight surprisingly light and dangerously frail in his arms. He tied the horses securely to a thick trunk and returned to the riverbank, assessing the swirling current. There was no time for hesitation. He settled the woman on his back, instructing the girl to hold onto her mother's dress and clutch his arm tightly, making himself the sole anchor against the river's pull. The water instantly shocked his skin with its icy bite as he plunged in, the current immediately trying to drag his feet out from under him. He leaned into the flow, using his considerable strength and grim determination to move laterally across the riverbed, each step a battle against the powerful force of nature. The girl, terrified but silent, buried her face against his shoulder, her tiny fingers digging into his coat and then finding purchase on his forearm, settling unnervingly close to the branded mark. The crossing seemed to take an eternity, the chilling water sapping his warmth and energy. But finally, with a staggering, lung-bursting effort, he hauled them onto the muddy bank of the other side. They collapsed there, beneath the drooping, mournful branches of a great, dying willow, its roots clinging precariously to the soil, a reflection of their own desperate state. The relief was instantaneous but short-lived. The woman, jarred by the rough journey in the cold water, was seized by a terrible, racking cough. When she brought her hand up to her mouth, the dark stain that blossomed immediately on her sleeve was undeniably blood. Cole, kneeling beside her, saw it, and the grim reality hit him with the force of a physical blow. She wouldn't make it far. Her strength was failing faster than the fever could be broken, and the rough flight was accelerating her demise. Her eyes, filled now with a profound, maternal desperation that cut through his hardened defenses, found his face. Her voice was weak, dissolving into the roar of the river, but her intent was clear. "Promise me you'll get her there," she pleaded, her hand reaching out weakly to clutch his coat. It was a final, unconditional plea, a desperate handover of the most precious thing in her life. Cole didn't pause to ask where there is. The destination was irrelevant to the vow. All that mattered was the promise. He simply nods, a curt, unbreakable acceptance of the burden and the responsibility. As if understanding the gravity of the unspoken pact, the girl's small hand wraps around his wrist, settling exactly over the scar of the brand, her innocent touch physically sealing the vow with a quiet, solemn finality that tied his marked past to her uncertain future. The cold, damp air of the riverbank, heavy with the scent of wet earth and impending morning, became the final, silent witness to the end of the woman's suffering. The night had passed in a grim vigil, Cole sitting upright against the rough trunk of the willow, his eyes fixed on the shallow, raspy rise and the fall of her chest, a rhythm that grew weaker and more sporadic with every passing hour. He hadn't slept, couldn't allow himself the luxury, the desperate sound of her labored breathing chaining him to the present moment. The girl, exhausted and clinging, had eventually fallen into a fitful, shallow sleep nestled against her mother's side. But in the hushed, darkest hour just before the first streak of gray light bled into the sky, the rhythmic, fighting breaths finally ceased, giving way to a profound, unsettling stillness. Cole knew instantly. There was no struggle, no final declaration, just the quiet, ultimate surrender to the forces that had been consuming her since they first found her. By morning, when the eastern ridge was outlined in a pale, cold glow, the woman is gone. Her face, though pale and still, finally held a semblance of peace, the terrible tension of pain and flight having completely dissolved. The girl wakes slowly, her eyes fluttering open to the morning light filtering through the willow branches. Her small hand reaches out instinctively for her mother, and she finds her cold, unnaturally still, wrapped in Cole's duster, a dark, heavy layer he had stripped off in the night to give her what little warmth he could spare. The girl's small, questioning gasp broke the silence. She didn't scream with rash. The immediate, crushing finality of the situation seemed to descend upon her with the weight of the duster itself. Cole was already moving, his actions driven by a necessity that precluded grief. He took his shovel, the only proper tool they had, and began to dig a shallow grave beneath the sprawling, dying willow, its desolate location feeling appropriate for this final, lonely rest. The work was grueling, the soil thick with river-soaked clay, but Cole worked with a fierce, controlled intensity, his jaw clenched, his movements a desperate form of penitence. He created a grave deep enough to protect her from scavengers and shallow enough to be finished before the sun fully cleared the ridge and revealed their position to any approaching riders. There were no words spoken, no ceremony, no gentle eulogy, only the raw, guttural sound of the shovel tearing into the earth and Cole's ragged, trembling breath as he worked. The silence was absolute, save for the grim sounds of the burial. When the hole was ready, he gently lifted the woman's slight body, wrapped tightly in the duster, and lowered her into the earth. It was a moment of stark, terrible simplicity as he began to push the dirt back into the grave, covering her. The girl finally succumbed to the immense pressure of her loss. Her shoulders began to shake, and then her tiny, heartbroken sobs echoed through the canyon, sharp, high-pitched sounds of pure grief that seemed to bounce off the rock walls, an indictment of the violent world that had robbed her. Cole did not look at her, could not bear to look at the fragile remnant of the family he had tried to save. He finished filling the grave, smoothing the earth with the back of his shovel, placing a few heavy stones on top to mark the spot. Then, he performed the one act of solemn reverence his harsh life still allowed. He straightened up, brushed the mud from his coat, and slowly removes his hat. The action, simple and profound, exposed his face to the cool morning air, revealing the lines of pain and exhaustion etched around his eyes. He stood there, staring at the horizon, where the sun was now burning bright and cold, a symbol of the dangerous, relentless journey that lay ahead. For the first time since he had seen the brand on his own hand, or perhaps since long before that, he allowed a whisper to escape his lips, a sound so faint it was lost immediately to the river's murmur, something that felt and sounded like a prairie plea for the dead now resting beneath the roots of the willow, and a desperate, internal vow for the living he now carries on his shoulders. The cold, small hand of the little girl, the promise still binding him, was all that mattered now. He replaced his hat, the gesture signaling the end of his sorrow and the resumption of his duty. He had a witness to protect, a journey to complete, and a destination, a there, to find, whatever the cost of his soul or his life might be. The morning after the burial was cold and quiet, the silence of the wilderness broken only by the crunch of their boots on the dried grass as they left the gravesite. Cole had secured their meager supplies, adjusted the saddle on the remaining mare, and gently lifted the girl, settling her in front of him. The weight of the world, and the weight of the promise he had made to a dying woman, rested heavily on his shoulders. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and steady, as they began to ride away from the river. "Where is there?" he asked, the word hanging starkly in the air, demanding the final, crucial detail he had deliberately ignored until now. The girl, her face solemn and streaked with the dried trails of tears, didn't flinch. She was clutching a small, tarnished locket, her mother's, a tiny, precious anchor in her storm of loss. She pointed a small, hesitant finger toward the west, toward the unforgiving vastness of the plains that rose into the distant, purple-hued mountains. She whispered the name, a sound that carried the fragile hope of refuge, Willow Bend Orphanage. She explained, in the simple, heartbreaking directness of a child recounting an immutable truth, that her mother's sister, her aunt, had once worked there. It wasn't just a place of shelter, it was the last known connection to family, the terminus of the desperate flight. Cole's mind immediately calculated the danger. It was a ride of at least 3 days across hostile land, territory known for its unforgiving elements, sparse water, and the very outlaws and corrupt men he sought to avoid. The path was riddled with potential threats, now multiplied by the fact that he was transporting the key witness against a powerful man. The true chase had only just begun. The first day of the journey was a grinding, silent ordeal. The girl rides in front of him, her small body rigid with grief and the unfamiliar proximity to the man who was now her sole protector. She clung to her locket, drawing strength from the memory it held. But as the afternoon wore on, and the crushing silence began to feel heavier than the heat of the sun, Cole realized that he could not, in good conscience, subject this child to a 3-day tomb of silence. He was tasked not just with delivering her body, but with preserving her spirit, and the way to do that, he suddenly understood, was to become human again, if only for her. He began to speak again at first, just small, simple observations about the land, the birds, the clouds. Then, tentatively, the words evolved into small stories, tales about the creatures of the desert, exaggerated and softened to take the edge off the harsh reality they were riding through. He didn't share anything about his violent life, only fragments of knowledge, bits of wisdom about survival, the color of the sky before a storm, the taste of clean water. Slowly, cautiously, the girl began to respond, her grip on the locket loosening just enough for her to turn her head and look up at him. She asked about the mark on his hand, no longer with fearful curiosity, but with a quiet, innocent acceptance, as if the brand was simply a feature of the landscape. And then, riding across the endless, silent plains, Cole finally opened the darkest vault of his soul, a place he had walled off with years of guilt and flight. He told her the truth of his past, not the details of the crime that earned the brand, but the root of the pain that had defined him ever since. Once, years ago, he had had a family, a home, and a child, a boy, about her age. And he failed to save his own child from a sickness that swept through their camp, a failure he carried as a heavier brand than the one burned into his skin. He confessed the guilt, the self-loathing, the reason he had taken to the lonely road, seeing himself as a harbinger of death, unworthy of connection. The words, forced out across the desolate landscape, were a powerful, painful release. The road became a confession trail, each mile a slow, arduous step towards self-forgiveness and a deeper understanding of the promise he had made. He wasn't just protecting a witness, he was earning a chance at atonement, using the last of his strength to save the child he had not been able to save before. His survival, he realized, was no longer his own, but a necessary vehicle for the completion of his final, sacred duty. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The unforgiving plains gave way to a sudden, startling relic of failed ambition and forgotten dreams as they crested a low hill late in the afternoon of the second day. A ghost town, a skeletal community bleached by the sun and left to crumble into the dust. It was an eerie, silent monument to the West's ruthless cycle of boom and bust, a place where the wind carried not just sand but the heavy, lingering sense of lives abruptly abandoned. Cole, recognizing the need for both rest and resupply, guided the weary mare into the shelter of the deserted main street, the hooves' dull clops echoing loudly off the silent, false-fronted buildings. The town was a study in decay and desolation. An empty saloon stood with its doors swinging on rusted hinges, the interior a ruin of broken glass and shattered hope. A church, its spire leaning precariously, had a broken church bell resting on the ground like a dropped skull, and everywhere there were echoes of laughter long gone, conjured by the sheer, overwhelming stillness. Cole tethered the horse and immediately set about the grim task of scavenging. His professional eye scanned the debris for anything useful, and he was able to find supplies: a half sack of dried beans in a forgotten general store, a clean canteen in a livery stable, and a coil of sturdy rope that might prove invaluable. He moved with a focused efficiency that betrayed no emotion, treating the place as merely another resource to exploit on their desperate route. Meanwhile, the girl, momentarily freed from the saddle, wandered tentatively through the wreckage, her small hand still gripping her mother's locket. While peering into the shattered window of a boarded-up house, she gave a soft cry, not of fear, but of discovery. On the dusty floor, lying half-buried beneath a piece of fallen ceiling plaster, she found a doll. It was a crude thing, clearly handmade, its cloth face faded and grubby, its simple calico dress torn, and tragically, missing one arm. She picked it up gently, brushing the dust from its threadbare surface, holding it as if it were the most precious treasure. She brought the doll back to where Cole was working, holding it up for his inspection, her eyes, though still holding the shadow of her recent loss, shining with a sudden, pure light. She looked at the damaged toy, then up at Cole, and stated a profound, simple truth that resonated with the forgotten man. "She's still beautiful," she said, her voice small but firm, recognizing the inherent worth of something broken and incomplete. The line, delivered with such earnest innocence, struck Cole with the force of a physical blow. It bypassed his layers of self-protection and isolation, shattering something inside him that had been frozen and hardened for years, the belief that broken things, like his life and his soul, were utterly devoid of beauty or worth. He stopped what he was doing, the supplies forgotten. He slowly turned toward her, then, with a heavy, deliberate movement, he kneels in the dust before her. The gesture was enormous, a total surrender of the guard at distance he had maintained since the beginning. He was eye level with her now, seeing not just a witness or a burden, but a whole, unbroken spirit. He looked intently into her eyes, which held the same fierce, unwavering hope as the doll's glass gaze. He reached out a scarred hand, the one with the brand, and gently wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. His throat was tight, the muscles in his face unused to such vulnerability, but he forced the words out, alone, quiet, an absolutely sincere rasp. "So are you?" he says quietly. It was an acknowledgement of her strength, her purity, and her ability to find light in the darkest corners. It was the first kind word he had spoken in years, perhaps since the last time he spoke to his own lost child. The simple exchange of humanity, in the middle of a dead town, marked a silent, seismic shift in their relationship. The protector had not just found supplies, he had found a fragile, renewed connection to the decency he thought he had extinguished forever. The silence of the ghost town, which had offered a brief, deceptive solace during the day, turned into a vast, resonating cavity for danger as night falls, thick and starless, plunging the deserted buildings into deep, oppressive shadow. Cole had chosen the most defensible structure, the old bank vault, its heavy iron door long gone, but its stone walls offering some measure of protection, and settled the girl inside, preparing a small, controlled fire for warmth and to cook the few beans they had scavenged. He had been expecting them, the final two bounty men, the ones he knew would be harder, angrier, and more determined than the scouts he had dispatched to the river. They arrived just as the small fire began to cast a flickering light on the girl's face, a beacon easily spotted in the encompassing gloom. Their arrival was announced not by the clumsy sound of hooves, but by the immediate, deafening crack of gunfire that tore through the front window of the abandoned bank, the noise echoing violently through the ruins. Cole reacted with the instinct of a man perpetually living on the razor's edge. In a single, desperate, fluid motion, he hurled himself across the stone floor, shielding the girl with his own body, knocking her down into the dirt-covered corner as the bullets chewed into the stone where she had been sitting. One shot, however, found its mark, slamming into his left shoulder with the sickening impact of a sledgehammer, spinning him around and ripping a scream from his lungs that he immediately swallowed down into a grunt of pain. The burning agony was instantaneous and overwhelming, but the pain was secondary to the chilling realization that they were exposed. He shoved his rifle into the girl's hand, a desperate, silent plea for her to hold it tight and stay hidden, and drew his own sidearm with his good right hand, ignoring the shocking wetness that was already soaking his coat. The attackers closed in, emboldened by the sound of his collapse and the assumption that the fight was over. They moved from the cover of the saloon and the general store, their forms huge and menacing in the darkness, confident of their quick victory and the substantial reward the marshal's brother was surely offering. Cole was fighting a losing battle against the pain, the numbness spreading quickly down his arm, but the sheer urgency of the promise he had made, the memory of his own lost child, ignited a terrifying, powerful reserve deep within him. He drew strength from a place deeper than flesh, fueled by a desperate, agonizing need for atonement and the fierce determination that this small, trusting life would not be a casualty of his failure. He rolled onto his back, ignoring the blinding flashes of muzzle fire, and squeezed the trigger twice. The silence of the ghost town, which had offered a brief, deceptive solace during the day, turned into a vast, resonating cavity for danger as night falls, thick and starless, plunging the deserted buildings into deep, oppressive shadow. Cole had chosen the most defensible structure, the old bank vault, its heavy iron door long gone, but its stone walls offering some measure of protection, and settled the girl inside, preparing a small, controlled fire for warmth and to cook the few beans they had scavenged. He had been expecting them, the final two bounty men, the ones he knew would be harder, angrier, and more determined than the scouts he had dispatched at the river. They arrived just as the small fire began to cast a warm, flickering light on the girl's face, a beacon easily spotted in the encompassing gloom. Their arrival was announced not by the clumsy sound of hooves, but by the immediate, deafening crack of gunfire that tore through the front window of the abandoned bank, the noise echoing violently through the ruins. Cole reacted with the instinct of a man perpetually living on the razor's edge. In a single, desperate, fluid motion, he hurled himself across the stone floor, shielding the girl with his own body, knocking her down into the dirt-covered corner as the bullets chewed into the stone where she had been sitting. One shot, however, found its mark, slamming into his left shoulder with the sickening impact of a sledgehammer, spinning him around and ripping a scream from his lungs that he immediately swallowed down into a grunt of pain. The burning agony was instantaneous and overwhelming, but the pain was secondary to the chilling realization that they were exposed. He shoved his rifle into the girl's hand, a desperate, silent plea for her to hold it tight and stay hidden, and drew his own sidearm with his good right hand, ignoring the shocking wetness that was already soaking his coat. The attackers closed in. Emboldened by the sound of his collapse and the assumption that the fight was over, they moved from the cover of the saloon and the general store, their forms huge and menacing in the darkness, confident of their quick victory and the substantial reward the marshal's brother was surely offering. Cole was fighting a losing battle against the pain, the numbness spreading quickly down his arm, but the sheer urgency of the promise he had made, the memory of his own lost child, ignited a terrifying, powerful reserve deep within him. He drew strength from a place deeper than flesh, fueled by a desperate, agonizing need for atonement and the fierce determination that this small, trusting life would not be a casualty of his failure. He rolled onto his back, ignoring the blinding flashes of muzzle fire, and squeezed the trigger twice. The morning that broke over the ghost town was cold and harsh, finding Cole in a state of agonizing, fractured consciousness, his shoulder throbbing with a rhythmic, intense pain that threatened to drag him back into the welcome darkness of unconsciousness. The girl, her face streaked with dirt and fear but her eyes burning with an unnatural focus, had managed to secure a crude bandage around his wound using her mother's shawl, and had then, with a strength that belied her size, helped him awkwardly mount the mare. The horse was now their only vehicle, the sole link between life and the quick, brutal end that awaited them if they stopped. Half conscious, his vision blurring at the edges, Cole held onto the saddle horn with a white-knuckled grip, his good arm uselessly wrapped around the girl who was sitting rigidly in front of him. His strength was utterly depleted, replaced by a consuming fatigue and the blinding agony that shot through him with every jarring step the horse took. He relied entirely on instinct and the sheer, unyielding force of his promise. When the pain became too intense, forcing a momentary lapse of awareness, the girl guides the horse, her small hands, surprisingly firm, would gently pull on the reins, steering the mare westward, keeping them on the faint trail toward the distant Below Bend orphanage. She had transformed from a passive, weeping refugee into a tiny, fierce navigator, her determination a palpable force that kept his own fading spirit anchored. The world was reduced to the sway of the horse, the relentless ache in his shoulder, and the quiet, desperate resolve of the child pressed against his chest. They rode for hours through a landscape that was brutally indifferent to their suffering, the sun beating down on them, turning the wound into a burning hell. But then, in the late afternoon, a profound shift occurred. The oppressive heat broke, and a faint, blessed scent of moisture drifted across the plains. Then, with a suddenness that made them both look up in startled disbelief, the rain falls for the first time in months. It began as a tentative sprinkle, then escalated into a heavy, cleansing deluge that instantly washed the caked dust from their faces, cooling Cole's feverish skin and washing the dry blood from his coat. It was a baptism, a moment of profound, startling grace in their violent flight. To Cole, hunched over and weakened, the touch of the cold water felt like a physical act of forgiveness, a momentary reprieve from the relentless judgment of the past. As the rhythm of the rain settled into a steady, comforting drumbeat on his hat, something shifted within him. He was too weak to focus on the bounty man or the pain. All that remained was the girl in the vast, soaking silence of the plains. And so, he began to talk, not of guns or flight, but of things that mattered beyond survival. He told her stories of the stars, of constellations he had learned to navigate by during lonely nights, and viewing the distant lights with names and histories of ancient heroes and forgotten lovers. He spoke of redemption, telling her that even the worst men could find their way back, that mistakes didn't have to define a life, and that a man's worth wasn't measured by his failures but by the promises he kept. He spoke of starting again, of finding new ground and building a life on the strength of a clean choice. His voice, though weak and punctuated by ragged breaths, carried an intimacy and sincerity born of their shared trauma and the realization that he was facing his end, and this was his final legacy. She listens, silently absorbing every word, her small body pressed securely against his, her unwavering attention a form of silent belief. The stories became a bridge, connecting his brutal, scarred past to her hopeful, fragile future. The desperate outlaw is slowly becoming something else on that long, wet ride, not just a protector, but a guardian, trading his grim silence for the hopeful resonance of fairy tales and second chances. In the way he spoke, the gentleness of his voice despite the pain, and the sheer fact that he was willing to trade his life for her safe delivery, he was becoming maybe even a father, a role he had failed at once, but was now desperately trying to earn back one agonizing mile at a time. The rain continued, washing away the vestiges of the fight, the dirt of the trail, and the long, bitter years of his self-imposed exile, leaving only the sound of their shared breath and the steady hoofbeats taking them toward the end of the promise. The final miles of the journey were the slowest and most excruciating. Cole's fever, stoked by the infection raging in his shoulder, had turned the landscape into a shimmering, distorted canvas of pain and exhaustion, yet the girl, his tiny, determined navigator, kept them moving. The rhythmic, dull thud of the mare's hoofs was the only constant, the metronome counting down the final beats of their desperate flight. They rode through the entire night, the rain-washed stars eventually giving way to the cold, pale light of dawn. And then, just as the sun began to peek over the eastern horizon, painting the sky with colors of triumphant gold and hopeful rose, the girl gasped. They had crested the last rise, and there, nestled quietly in the crook of the valley below, was their destination. They see it, Willow Bend. It was not the grand, imposing structure Cole might have imagined, but a collection of sturdy, well-kept buildings, a simple, wooden church, a main two-story house, and several small outbuildings, all emanating a warm, tangible sense of stability and life. Small but alive, the settlement was unmistakable, with plumes of white smoke rising from the chimneys, a comforting, domestic signal of warmth and safety. A small, enclosed yard held the promise of children playing, and the sight, after the endless hostility of the plains, struck Cole with the force of an overwhelming, physical relief. The journey was over. As the horse picked its way down the slope, their approach was spotted from the main house. A woman emerged, throwing open the front door with such force it hit the wall, and she began to run toward them across the yard, her figure quickly growing larger and clearer. She was a woman of strong build, dressed in a plain but neat woolen skirt and apron, her hair escaping her severe bun, and her face a study in utter disbelief mixed with raw, agonizing hope. It could only be the girl's aunt. As she drew close, she slowed, her run becoming a staggering walk, her eyes fixing first on the exhausted, tear-stained face of the girl, and then on the grim, blood-soaked figure of Cole. Tears immediately began cutting through the soot and disbelief on her face, a mix of grief for her sister and profound relief for her niece. The girl, seeing the familiar face, gave a choked sob and reached out, the final dam of her composure breaking. Cole halted the mare a few yards from the woman, and with a tremendous, last-gasp expenditure of his failing strength, Cole lifts the girl down. His muscles screamed in protest, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably, not just from exhaustion, but from the sudden, terrifying release of tension. He gently placed the girl into her aunt's waiting, fierce embrace, their reunion a sudden explosion of tearful, whispered comfort. He watched them cling to one another, two pieces of a broken family finding each other again. The air felt thick with emotion, a stark contrast to the cold, lonely fear they shared for days. Cole, slumped on the horse, the wound in his shoulder burning like a furnace, fought to maintain his composure. He looked at the aunt, forcing his eyes to stay open, to witness the completion of his task. "She's safe now," he says, the words raw and scratchy, a mere croak, though his voice trembles with the effort and the sudden, acute awareness of his own imminent collapse. The aunt, clinging tightly to the girl with one arm, turned her gaze back to the man who had delivered the miracle. She saw the wound, the blood, the brand, and the exhaustion that went bone deep. She didn't ask about the bounty men or the flight. She asked the only question that mattered to the living. "Will you stay?" she asks, her voice thick with gratitude and concern, offering him the chance for rest, for healing, for sanctuary. Cole paused, looking at the safety, the warmth, and the simple, gentle life he had brought the girl back to, a life utterly closed off to him. He shook his head, a decisive, definitive movement that cost him dear. The brand on his wrist seemed to burn with the refusal. His voice, barely a rasp now, carried the weight of his inescapable fate. "Some men don't get to rest," he replied, the words a final, terrible admission of his status as a man permanently outside the fences of decency and peace. The promise was kept, the child was safe, and with his duty fulfilled, the branch had claimed him back. He subtly nudged the mare, ready to turn his back on the light, on Willowbent, and on the last faint hope of his own redemption. The choice was made in the quiet, decisive finality of a man who understood his own damning nature. Cole turned the mare's head, and without another word, without a look back at the safety and warmth of Willowbent, he urged the horse away, leaving the valley of sanctuary to those who deserved it. The aunts pleaded for him to stay, the girl silent, clinging hope. They were the strongest chains he had never felt. But he was a creature of the wilderness and the shadow, and he knew he could not bring his darkness into their light. His body was a screaming landscape of pain. The bullet wound in his shoulder felt like a searing iron, and the fever had fully taken hold, making the air around him thick and suffocating. Yet, he was wounded but alive, his survival a testament not to luck, but to the sheer, unyielding force of a promise kept. He rode slowly up the rise he had just ascended, his silhouette growing smaller and more desolate against the brilliant morning sky. The sun, now fully risen, was cold and bright, emphasizing his isolation, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to claw at his heels. He was running again, not from bounty men. For the moment, they were either dead, wounded, or temporarily lost, but from the crushing weight of belonging, from the realization that his freedom was inherently tied to his solitude. As he reached the crest of the hill, the wind shifted, and a sound, faint yet clear, carried across the valley floor and found him. It was the solemn, hopeful peal of the church bell ringing, not the broken clang of the derelict town, but a steady, resolute chime from the small, clean church at Willowbend, a sound of renewal and community, a simple declaration that life and goodness had prevailed. The sound was his final benediction, the only reward he would accept. He didn't turn back, but he paused, letting the vibrations wash over him, a silent acknowledgement of the peace he had bought with his own blood. Then, with a decisive nudge of the mare, he disappears into the sun, becoming a dark, small figure dissolving into the vast, indifferent landscape. Back in the valley, nestled safely in her aunt's arms, the girl watches him go, her gaze unwavering until his figure was completely swallowed by the distance and the glare. She didn't cry. The terror was over, replaced by a quiet, profound understanding of the sacrifice made for her. Her small hand instinctively moved to her chest, clutching her locket, the memory of her mother and the silent strength of the man who had delivered her forever intertwined. Life at Willowbend settled back into its rhythms, a gentle routine of warmth and care. But the events of that dawn would become a local legend. Later, the townsfolk will speak of the stranger who rode out of the wilderness, wounded and desperate, and brought her home. The stories, as is always the case, grew and fractured under the weight of retelling. Some call him outlaw, pointing to the visible exhaustion and the signs of violence that clung to him, believing him to be a common criminal who found a momentary, unlikely conscience. Others say he was an angel with a scar on his hand, focusing on the uncharacteristic act of selflessness, the gentle way he had handled the child, and the fact that he sought no reward, asking only to be allowed to leave. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in the complicated, shadowed space where a man branded for a past crime performs an act of pure, selfless redemption, using the various skills honed in darkness to deliver light. Cole was neither purely a saint nor entirely a sinner. He was a man defined by the choices he made in the final, agonizing chapters of his story, a man who found his humanity in keeping a promise he was never obliged to make. And though no one knows where he went, vanishing completely back into the anonymity of the endless frontier, his presence lingered. Every dawn that breaks over the valley feels like his doing. The silence and the safety he ensured serving as quiet, enduring proof that redemption rides the long road home, a solitary figure forever bound to the wilderness by his scar, but forever tethered to the valley by his sacred vow. If this story restored a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.